Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about Sign of the Unicorn by Roger Zelazny. This book was originally published in 1975 and is part of what is known as the Chronicles of Amber series. The edition I have is Fantasy Masterworks, which collects all of the Chronicles of Amber books, or at least the first 5, which make up the Corwin cycle, into one volume. And Sign of the Unicorn is the third book in that volume. It's the third book in the Chronicle of Amber series. So it's from here to here is Sign of the Unicorn. I think nowadays maybe it's more common to get these books in a collected edition like this, although I don't know, I've not researched it. Let me know in the comments if anybody knows. But I'm reviewing these books separately, well, for a couple of reasons. One is because they were originally published separately back in the 1970s, so originally they were separate books. And two, because I'm a slow reader, I don't trust myself to remember everything if I wait until the end of this volume to make a review. So I've been reviewing them book by book, and this is the third book. I should mention, though, I've been on Goodreads and I've been researching this a bit, and there appear to be several people of the mindset that it's pretty pointless to review the separate books because it all makes one big story and you should just read the one big story and then review that. And I'm beginning to wonder if maybe that would have been the wiser course, if that would have been the wiser course, because I find myself at the end of Sign of the Unicorn with very much the same type of thoughts that I had with the previous two books. I mean, once again, I'm going to be talking about how imaginative this book is, about how the strange and mysterious lands or worlds that Zelazny creates, about some of the descriptive passages that I found a little bit hard to parse. It's going to be much the same things as I was talking about in the previous two reviews. That being said, though, having committed to review these books, book by book, I'm going to try and make a go of this and see if I can't find a few intelligent things to say, or at least things to say. And I'm going to get into the plot and talk about spoilers, because we're 3 books in at this point, so there's nothing really to talk about except talking about plot specifics with this book. So, if you haven't read these books, don't watch this video. If you're looking for just a general recommendation, I absolutely recommend it. If you can track these books down somehow, the Chronicle of Amber series, Fantasy Masterworks, or whatever edition you find, the more I get into these books, the more interesting I'm finding them. So that's my recommendation. Now on to the spoilers. So, I read somewhere on the internet, I forget where, maybe it was Wikipedia, although I was checking the Wikipedia page just before I filmed this video and couldn't find it. Who knows, maybe I'm misremembering, but I read somewhere on the internet that these books, the Chronicle of Amber series, are often called a cross between hard-boiled detective fiction and fantasy, which I thought was a weird combination when I read it, but sure enough, you know, in the first book, of course, the first book, starts off with Corwin still on Earth and has elements of maybe detective type setting, and that's continued all the way through these books, and Sign of the Unicorn definitely has this. Raymond Chandler, I believe, was somebody I heard compared with Zelazny or the Chronicles of Amber. I've not read a lot of Raymond Chandler books, and the one I did read was several years ago. But one of my memories is that he spends a lot of time talking about the coffee that they drink and the cigarettes that they smoke and the alcohol that they drink and the sandwiches that they eat. It's Raymond Chandler books, or at least the one I read, seemed to be very focused on well, what's the word for it? Eating and drinking and smoking. And that's been a theme in the Chronicle of Amber series all the way through, and it's also a theme in this book. But more so than that, the detective part of this book, or the hard-boiled detective part of this book, part of this series, is really on display in this book. I mean, it starts off with a dead body. And then the whole mystery throughout this book is who is responsible for this dead body. It's one of the princes of Amber, Cain, since I'm already spoiling things, I might as well give specifics, who's found dead, and Corwin, the main character, knows that he is going to be suspected of it, even though he didn't do it. So he first enlists his brother Random to try and talk about who might have done it and possible motives and how to present this to the rest of them in a way that won't make people suspicious. But eventually they do have to present it to the rest of the brothers and sisters. And then, of course, the other mystery in this book, I say of course because I'm assuming if you're watching this video you're familiar with this, is Brand, who they rescue from his imprisonment. And then the mystery is who imprisoned Brand in the first place, and then once Brand is rescued, somebody tries to murder him. And then the mystery is who tried to murder him. And then there's a great scene where they're all sitting in the sitting room and smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol, and there are several references made to the fire in the fireplace. So you can imagine a roaring fire going on here, maybe the shadows flickering, although the part about the fire being roaring or the shadows flickering isn't explicitly stated in the prose, but just all those references to fireplaces, you can imagine it. And they're all sitting around hypothesizing over who had the motive to do the murder. So I think it was so-and-so because of this, or it couldn't have been so-and-so because of this. And that struck me as, well, I don't know if maybe hard-boiled detective is quite the right word for it. Maybe it's as much Agatha Christie as anything else. But just sitting around this great room of a castle trying to decide who the murderer was, or who the attempted murderer was. So, because I had previously read that these books were a cross between hard-boiled detective fiction and fantasy, I thought that this probably qualified as well. But yeah, then there's the fantasy part of it. And so my takeaway from the fantasy is that the imagination on display here is just really impressive. I mean, there's so much to imagine here, and there's some really incredible scenes being created. But the other thing is, I will admit that at times I had trouble following it. So I'm not sure what I want to talk about first. I guess I'll talk about first the fact that I had trouble following it. So there are a few different scenes here. One is when Random travels to the Black Tower, and they've got those orbiting rocks kind of making circles around the Black Tower. And then the other one is that, I forget the name of it. It's some sort of strange Irish name anyways, I believe, or Celtic name. But that castle up in the moonlight, which Corwin travels up to. And which is just a reflection of Amber up in the sky. And then the ending scene, when they're following the unicorn and they go through this transformation and come out the other side onto what is apparently the real Amber. All three of those scenes were scenes that I had a little bit of trouble figuring out what was going on. And this has been my comment or my complaint on this series in general, is Zelazny's prose, I think, can be a little bit difficult to follow at times. I mean, at times it's perfectly straightforward. So, those fire room scenes where they're all sitting around the fireplace speculating about who had the motive to do the murder, that's perfectly straightforward. But the strange and mystical lands part, I think the prose is difficult to follow. And I think this is for a few different reasons. One reason I think is Zelazny is making a deliberate choice not to spell out everything for the reader, because he wants to give you just enough detail so that you can imagine it, but that you can imagine it in your own way. So this is one of those books where the imagination of the reader is meeting the prose of the author halfway or more than halfway and filling in all the gaps. And I suspect that's deliberate. It's got to be deliberate, right? On top of that, though, there are some sentences which are a little bit hard to read, and I think Zelazny is probably being a little bit coy here, or he's toying with the reader sometimes with making you work a bit to figure out what that sentence actually means. You've got to kind of slow down and linger over a few of these sentences. But on top of that, I think you just have to read these parts slowly and pay attention. And maybe here's where I get into my failings as a reader. Sometimes, especially when I'm reading descriptions of places in novels, I don't read it carefully enough. Perhaps this is a habit I picked up over years of reading novels with long descriptions, or perhaps I'm just a careless reader, or maybe a combination of the two, but I don't fully absorb every sentence sometimes when I'm reading these descriptive sections. And you need to with a writer like Zelazny. And I noticed after I finished it, and before filming this review, I thought I'd go back and review some of the earlier sections. So I reread this chunk of the book from, what is it, in my edition, from page 344 to page 434, so the first 100 pages. And because I wasn't in a hurry to see where the plot was going, I just read everything slowly and carefully. And that whole section with random traveling to the Dark Tower, you know, when I first read that, I could understand the general thrust of the action. Like, he's being attacked by something, he's being pursued by something about moving rocks, but I was largely confused about the details. I did discover, when I went back and I just read it very slowly and focused on every sentence, then I actually could understand what was going on. So I guess you have to read these sections carefully, is what I'm saying, and that'll give you a much better idea of what is going on, even though if you're like me, you've got to force yourself to pay attention during the descriptive parts. I also, I don't know if this would help anybody else, but I found it helped me. After I finished this book, I went to Wikipedia and read the Wikipedia summary of it. Though there is at least, I mean, you know, Wikipedia is always changing from month to month because anyone can edit it at any time. But at least at the time of filming of this video, there's a fairly detailed plot summary on the Wikipedia page for this book. And you can go through it, and there are a couple points where I was like, okay, so that's what was happening. You know, I kind of had a vague idea, but that plot summary helped me out. And actually, there was a few things that the Wikipedia plot summary pointed out to me that I completely missed. The most notable one was the fact that when Corwin was talking to Brand, Wikipedia said that Brand displayed pyrotechnic abilities. And I was like, I don't remember that. And then I was like, I probably missed it. So I went back and I reread that section again. And sure enough, it was in there. It was page 460 in the Masterwork edition. Masterwork edition, keep in mind, is combining all 5 of these books into one volume. According to Wikipedia, this book, when it was published on its own, was only 187 pages. But anyways, it is in there. So Corwin is talking to Brand, and they're exchanging information, and Brand is telling him the whole important backstory and kind of revealing some of these mysteries that have been lingering the whole time. And picking up on that paragraph, he says, "Let me finish in my own fashion, Corwin. I am not unmindful of your thought processes as you speak. I feel the pain in your side twin to my own. Yes, I know these things, and many more. His eyes burned strangely as he took another cigarette into his hand, and it lit of its own accord. He drew heavily upon it and spoke as he exhaled. I broke with the others over this decision. I saw it as involving too great a peril, as placing Amber herself in jeopardy. Broke with them. He watched the smoke for several moments before he continued. But things were too advanced that I might simply walk away, etc. It continues from there. So I think just that one sentence is where Brand is revealing to Corwin that he had pyrotechnic abilities. He took another cigarette into his hand and it lit of its own accord. Now, when I read it aloud, it's not really fair, because when you read stuff aloud, it's maybe more easily to absorb and it gets emphasized more, etc. But when I was reading it the old-fashioned way, reading it with my eyes, I completely missed that little sentence, and it lit of its own accord. And I think the reason I completely missed it is because I was so focused on the dialogue, kind of revealing this backstory. But there's an example of a little important detail that was snuck in there, which, I don't know, might have... I say important detail. It actually was not important at all in Sign of the Unicorn. I'm assuming it becomes important in the future books. I don't know. I'll find out as I continue reading. But at any rate, an example of a detail, important or not, that was snuck in there that, if you're like me, you could completely miss it until I went back to the Wikipedia summary. And one or two other things like that, which the Wikipedia summary helped me with this book. So, it wasn't the easiest book in the world to understand, and again, some of it's on me. If you read it slowly and carefully, you'll get most of it. But yeah, absolutely fascinating. At this point, I'm completely hooked on it. The strange and mysterious places are completely strange and mysterious and wonderful. That dark tower which Random goes to, and it's got all those strange orbiting rocks, and it's got that giant snake where you can see through his body, and Random says, he saw another man half digested in the snake's stomach, and then he has to fight the snake, and then there are those strange creatures with spikes on their hands, and if you kill them, or if you kill the snake, they float upwards for some reason. And then they're able to pursue him as he travels through many different, what are called shadows in this book, what are essentially multiverses, apparently. That they're able to chase him through all that. And it's just, the imagination on display in these books is really something. It's really fun to read these books and imagine it with the author. And then the journey to that... ghostly kingdom up in the sky where Corwin is traveling on these moonlight steps, and I just found it fascinating, and we had known in the first book that under the sea there was another version of Amber, which was like a mirror image of Amber, only in reverse, that you got to by traveling under the sea. Now we find out that if you wait till the moon is just right and the moon shines on these certain steps, you can go up a moonlit staircase into a sort of ghost Amber, which is up in the sky, which apparently is another parallel version of Amber. And Corwin goes up there because he needs to try and find out some information. And I really find the imagination and these places that the author has created really interesting in this book, as has been true of the whole series. And then, of course, there's the intrigue and the plot. And this is, in a lot of series, the further along you get, the more invested you get in the plot and the characters. And that's been happening to me. Now that I'm a fair way into this series, finished book 3 now out of 5 books in the first cycle, I'm really starting to get into some of these mysteries, like Dworkin, where is he gone, or Oberon, or who imprisoned Brand, or those 2 older brothers who died mysteriously. What actually happened to them? And one of the clever things is that these mysteries have been there since book 1. There were allusions to almost all of these things in book 1. But in book 1, you were so focused on the central conflict of Corwin trying to fight Eric and get into gain control of the Throne of Amber, that all these other little details were just off to the side. And mostly that was true with book 2 as well. You got a little bit more insight maybe. But then book 3, all these details and mysteries that have been there since book 1, but you've been so busy focusing on other things that you've forgotten to focus on them, are now coming into the fore a lot more. And certainly by the end of book 3, they seem to be taking the main focus. And so now I'm like, oh, okay, I can't wait to go on to book 4 now to find out what happens with these. So it's clever the way that was done. Assuming that was all planned out in advance, I don't know. Steve Donahue once in one of his videos, I have no idea which video it is now because he makes like 2 videos every day. So it's impossible to go back and find the quote you were looking for. But I believe at one point he says he doesn't think Zelazny planned this all out from the beginning. Maybe he was referring to the second cycle of stories, I don't know. But it seems to me like there are a lot of Easter eggs. Easter eggs is the wrong word for this, isn't it? There are a lot of hints given in the earlier books that have assumed more detailed meaning in the later books. And it seems like this is paying off and the pieces are snapping into place. And it's really becoming much more interesting the further you get along in this. I think this must have been all planned out in advance, right? I don't know. Yeah, and then of course the general intrigue of this book. Who was responsible for Cain's death? We get some clue at the end, I think, who imprisoned Brand. Did we find out who was responsible for Cain's death? I don't think we did yet. Maybe I'll have to go back and check that part again. But yeah, it's I'm really enjoying this series, and we'll definitely continue on with book 4, The Hand of Oberon, and I should be back with a video about that shortly.